Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Build Fast, Secure Well, Automate DevSecOps, and Secure Your Cloud. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Ask a Questions tab at the bottom of your screen. We will reserve time at the end of the webcast to address all questions. Our speaker for today is Vikram Varakantam, Senior Director of Product at Lacework. He is a long-term veteran in the security and cloud domain. He has experience in managing SaaS products and service portfolios in the area of cloud security, including next-generation firewall, IPS, and managed services. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I'm going to turn things over to today's presenter.
Thank you, Hillary. Thanks for joining our webinar today. I want to go over some of the premises of how do you build fast and at the same time secure well while operating in your cloud. The premise of this presentation is around how do you automate. One is understand what's needed in the cloud security. Two is how do you go about figuring out the use cases and build some automation from the get-go when you start building these cloud infrastructures. I'm a Senior Director of Products at Lacework. Our focus has been addressing a solution that completes a complete cloud security continuum all the way from infrastructure to the container world. And I want to go over some of the details in terms of why this problem at scale is very interesting and how you can get some control over your security story in the cloud using automation and DevSecOps processes. So let's start with some very basics. In terms of why is the cloud security story interesting. If you kind of go back to a decade ago, the very first wave of cloud adoption started with primarily around SaaS applications. You're starting to adopt a lot more of SaaS applications outside of your organizational boundary, wherein your primary concern of areas were primarily around who is using those services, are they using it well or not. The second wave of cloud journey is much larger from a technology shift perspective as your infrastructure moves out of your premises and where you start to really adopt platform as a service, infrastructure as a service type of technologies. What this really creates is both opportunity and risk when it comes to defining your compliance and security stories. Today I want to focus on a couple of different things. One is how do you kind of tackle this transition in a way that scales with your growth. Two is what are some of the organizational considerations you need to kind of think about from the get-go so you're prepared for this massive technology shift. So a lot of these conversations starts with very simple premise that aren't public cloud providers already secure today? Yes, if you compare to the on-prem world, moving into a public cloud environment, there's a huge investment and feature mature capabilities around the capabilities of the cloud providers themselves. What really boils down to is most people forget that you share the responsibility of your security when it comes to using the public cloud providers. What is the big difference between the on-prem security and the cloud provider security is primarily boils down to a shared responsibility model. One of the things where it really becomes interesting is that you are responsible for the hygiene, the configuration, the management of the services offered by the cloud provider. And an area of key concern that Gartner continues to highlight is that service providers themselves have the capabilities, whereas as an organization, you're responsible to make sure that you are using those capabilities to define your security journey in the cloud. What it really boils down to is by 2022, there's a prediction in the industry that 95% of cloud failures will be an organizational responsibility versus the provider's responsibility. Put it another way, only 5% of those will be provider's fault. What it really boils down to is you're owning pretty much majority of the security responsibilities when it comes to the shared responsibility model. And there's a whole list of activities that go around how do you prosecute this shared responsibility model. And there's a huge fundamental difference in terms of how these things work in an on-premise environment, whereas when you start to adopt more of the cloud paradigms, you're truly moving away from tools to language of APIs and API security. This is where you need to start to invest in terms of what are my processes, what are my goals when I start to adopt infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and at the same time scale in this public cloud environments. The most interesting one starts with organizational responsibility. First is recognizing that organizational responsibilities cut across multiple teams. Typically what we see in this segment is that the responsibilities fall under developers who are starting to embrace this public cloud services more openly to be able to drive the scale and the velocity needed to scale the business. And two is the traditional security teams trying to understand in terms of how this scale and adoption tries to create friction in terms of how traditional security models used to work. One of the things that that kind of differentiates compared to a traditional on-premise security and operational model is that most of the times we find DevOps teams and security teams can often find at odds with each other. The reason being DevOps is associated with independence and rapid pace of innovation as you start to really embrace the API-driven cloud orchestration models. And security teams' view of risk is pretty much is viewed as a risk to the compliance in terms of the independence is viewed as a bottleneck to the organizational risk and compliance responsibilities. At the same time, the DevOps teams believe that compliance regulations and security risk management, the way it is traditionally defined, is really a hindrance to speed and scale. The truth, however, is finding a harmonious balance between both of these teams. Where we have seen a bridge that exists between both of these teams successfully to be able to navigate this new world is bringing automation as a day one requirement. As enterprises evolves and becomes more complex, there is a potential for human error and misconfigurations, as we kind of referenced in the previous slide. This is one of the key factors in your risk management when it comes to public cloud. In terms of complexity and managing this complexity, bringing in requirements from a security point of view into the DevOps workflow and prosecuting it together kind of creates a harmonious relationship between the security teams and developers so that you're continuing to scale in the cloud at the same time building security as an automation framework. So both innovation and risk management can continue to work together to drive your business objectives. And this is where we are starting to see a trend where security teams are starting to move from mandates for thou shall not do this at hypotheticals to more of a collaborative partners with with DevOps. And what it really boils down to is the tools and the processes and the things that that you start to embrace needs to kind of take that factor into consideration. And there's always going to be a bridge between two different worlds in terms of how security is seen. It's just in terms of differing views between what traditional security and DevOps teams have from their vantage point and a viewpoint. Traditional security was always concerned about IP addresses, firewall rules, hardware appliances, virtual appliances, rule configurations, and threat intelligence and correlation and threat signatures. This was pretty much, was I would say, for the last decades of security purview was always about making sure that all of these assets are kind of managed with this paradigm. DevOps is a whole new element, brings in a whole new element of assets and the care abouts. Most of the DevOps philosophies are centered around the type of the asset frameworks that I need to use, multi-clouds, containers, hosts, custom applications. How can I scale across my virtual machines, containers, and serverless as things start to pick up, and how can I automate all of this so that I do it once and scale it many times. And the kind of the paradigms that they care about from a hygiene and a security point of view were more centered around operational reliability, misconfiguration. So it's interesting that both of these teams have different vantage points, but at the end of the day, they are kind of entrusted with both innovation and risk management when it comes to enterprise adoption of cloud. Where it really comes down to is how do you take a viewpoint of IP addresses and how do you map to an ephemeral world of cloud where the IP addresses kind of really lose their meaning and where tag starts to have much more meaning when you think about asset types, right? This is where you need to start to think about how do we kind of translate some of the existing requirements to the new world where the care abouts are quite different than what you're traditionally used to. And why is this important, right? Why is this important is, the risk of cloud misconfiguration really amplifies very rapidly as your infrastructure adoption goes out of your infrastructure premises. A single misconfiguration could really, expose your critical data, critical customer configuration, customer information, and more importantly, it puts your reputation at stake. Data breaches and data exfiltration are not really new. It applies to both old world and new world equally alike. But where it really matters from a public cloud or a cloud journey perspective is that a single misconfiguration could really amplify your ability to be able to get published in the cloud and get published in the news about a misconfiguration. S3 data breaches are pretty common. They're all over the news, and you probably want to tackle it head on within your automation and with your mutual collaboration with your ops and security world, so that you're not inherently exposing some of these risks. The second part of it is, you're continuing to see a new age of risks, right? In terms of crypto mining is pretty common across exposed cloud resources. A single compromise of your API key can lead to both organizational impact, as reputation impact, as well as resourcing impact in terms of like how you really start to spend those dollars for the cloud in kind of supporting some of these crypto mining activities. This is where hygiene becomes important, having a process in place becomes important, and automation driving all of these things. And it's only amplifying. The simple way to think about it is, these risks and threats are ever present. As companies increasingly migrate their applications and workloads to cloud, you're starting to see a readaptation of new risk vectors. New threat actors with different variations of malware attacks, cloud server breaches, brute force attacks. End of the day, your organizational footprint in the cloud becomes an interesting attack vector from a threat actor perspective. And the automation that drives this adoption and the hygiene that you built into that adoption is really the key driver for protecting your reputation in the cloud. One of the most widely observed objectives of attacking an organizational cloud infrastructure primarily has been an economic opportunity for crypto mining. It kind of had certain subtext to that, is that it's kind of it's kind of evolving pretty rapidly. As you start to embrace a larger footprint in cloud, it creates an interesting economic opportunity for threat actors, not so much from the reputation point of view, but more so from a resource exploitation standpoint. So you got to consider both of these beyond traditional compliance. You got to be able to prepare for incident response and things like that. So let's kind of put a framework together in terms of how do you kind of go about solving this cloud adoption story from the purview of both compliance and security, right? You really have to boil it down in terms of the frameworks that you wanna start adopting internally, and kind of divvy up by capabilities and the use cases that you're really going after. Compliance and audit control really forms the basis as you start to embrace cloud as your destination. At a very basic level, most of this kind of ties back to your core business requirements, is that I need to be compliant with CI at the very minimum of CIS benchmarks, or PCI is something that my organization has relevance to it, or SOC 2 if I'm a SaaS provider, or HIPAA if I'm processing healthcare data. And the more stringent case is you're starting to embrace like NIST 853 or FISMA standards. Essentially what it really boils down to is that compliance kind of becomes the basis for making some of these organizational control decisions, and starting with that creates a baseline hygiene, and then build upon it to bring in account security. When you talk about account security, is that it really boils down to is how are your developers and your users using, PaaS and IaaS services? Are they using it in the boundaries of the, independence we have negotiated between DevOps and security teams? Is there any anomaly within that usage models? Are they kind of tying back to some of the organizational controls that have been agreed upon, mutually agreed upon? And more importantly, are continuously profiling the usage and understanding, are there any known anomalies, like, a new region that we've never seen before started to be used? This is the kind of the, or different layered models that you want to start building in terms of your cloud journey. The most interesting thing is, as you go down this layer model, it gives you an opportunity to bring, a defense and depth approach. The ultimate destination is, you start to have, at a host layer, you start to bring in your host and containers into this cloud infrastructure. You start to, consider all of these as different layers that you own the responsibility and care and feed for, and all of these layers could be a footprint that's exploitable. So your organizational capabilities, when you think about shared responsibility model for cloud security, should cut across all of these layers to be able to have a very defined and managed journey into cloud operations. This becomes interesting. Traditionally, security has been very perimeter focused, as in that you define a choke point, which basically comes down to is you are gating and managing all aspects of your security to a defined set of rules, and you're understanding you're unpacking the packets that cut across these gates, and you're kind of analyzing within SIEMs. A lot of this kind of start to fall away, from a perspective of how, traditionally how cloud is being adopted. You are moving from IP addresses and rules to more, moving into APIs and the security associated with APIs. And you're starting to really embrace the fact that who has access to those APIs, what kind of orchestration they can, enable across those APIs, really start to become front and center versus, having gates and being able to understand what's crossing across this gate. When it comes to traditional intrusion detection, the idea of being able to unpack a packet and understand the details of this is diminishing from the perspective of primarily, adoption of encryption widely, and more importantly, most cloud providers today does not have full visibility into the packet flows. That creates, blind spots in your cloud journeys. And the third aspect of it is all of these infrastructures are built for massive elasticity and scale. And when you're starting to bring in the paradigm of choke points to your cloud journey, you're really starting to diminish the value of cloud and embracing cloud as it should be. And your tools like your SIEM, which is the data collection correlation tools, are only as good as the data you feed into. So this is where you really need to start to think about, like, can I take my existing tool set to the cloud, or should I need to really start thinking about a new set of tools that can cut through my different layers and also bring in, my organizational responsibility front and center. There's a lot of interesting tools out there from a open source perspective for very point specific problems. What really comes down to from a planning and strategy perspective is how do you tie those to your organizational outcomes when it comes to security? And let's also kind of understand in terms of really, why is cloud security really hard? One is it's a different paradigm. One thing that you need to recognize is it's quite different from what you're traditionally used to, where you had asset management was defined and understood, and assets seldom did not change as much as in the cloud world, where you have the concept of ephemeral assets that come and go in a matter of minutes. From a security standpoint, lack of visibility into these workloads as they change over time is one of the key requirements that we hear from our customer base. The two is a lot of this depends upon instrumentation in terms of how much automation do you want to be able to build into different layers of your organizational responsibility, so that you're more focused on outcomes versus actually stitching together the data. And the third of it is that all of this instrumentation need to really scale at the speed of DevOps and really reach the scale of cloud, where you can move from 10 hosts to 100 hosts in a matter of minutes. This is something that teams that are starting to adopt this cloud migration journey are starting to really consider, as one is visibility across different layers of the cloud is a key requirement. Two is being able to instrument tools or technology that kind of scales at the speed of cloud, so you're not missing out any transitions within your cloud environment rapidly, is something that you need to consider as part of your requirement. And what do we really need to solve this, right? There are a lot of different point application of technologies, but what in our experience, operating in this domain over the course of the last 5 years, our goal always has been being able to fit into these different pillars that drive, the value efficiency on our product side. Speed, you need to be able to rapidly, meet the requirements of speed. The solution, it needs to be able to become an accelerator for your cloud adoption journey versus, creating bottlenecks for adoption. Two is scale. You need to more focus on the scale of your business outcomes versus the scaling of the tools. This is where you start to embrace the right tools that can scale up and down with your needs. Elasticity is a day one requirement for us. We understand that your needs in cloud are not static. They change over time, moving from scaling up to 2x to 10x, depending upon how your business grows. All of this needs to have, for us to be able to deliver the right context, we need a lot of data. We need the capabilities to be able to process data. And more importantly, any of these needs to be tied together through automation, being able to, orchestrate ourselves into the DevOps pipeline that drives some of this scaling needs to be a day one requirement for us. So what have we done here, right, in terms of just kind of setting the stage in terms of what's our fundamental, value differentiation when it comes to enabling a seamless journey for your cloud adoption. It's primarily, is around taking that framework, the layered framework we talked about, as the basis for capabilities. When I talk about product capabilities, I'm talking about compliance is primarily a business enabler, taking that as the basis for, from a feature capability standpoint, and really evolving into the deeper context around how we can bring in the same level of visibility across your different asset type, different cloud providers, different workflows, and more importantly, doing this automatically so you don't have to manage the tool versus you're consuming, the analysis and the outcomes from a tool perspective. That really gets you to help you. One is, get unmatched visibility when it comes to your cloud infrastructures. Two is compliance and audit control is something that we factor in as a core requirement. Given the precedence of open S3 bucket, something, we want to basically make sure that it's tied into the platform at its core offering, so that you are not managing compliance in one point of view and intrusion detection and threat defense is another point of view. All of this, combined together as a single capability that you can choose and subscribe to, and grow with your needs in the cloud. And as I talk about some of the use cases, you kind of start to embrace in terms of why this layered framework becomes really essential. One is our capabilities cut across all of these layers within the cloud and the choices that you have today, both on-prem as well as the public cloud infrastructure. But more importantly, our goal always is to tie into that cloud ops workflow so that we become the enabler for the dev and the SecOps and the ops teams to really come together and really start to embrace the journey of DevSecOps as the basis for this transition. At the same time, bridge the world of both compliance and security together, so you're not stitching together data, whereas you're really driving the outcomes both from a compliance and a security standpoint. So let's kind of take a little bit deeper dive in terms of how are our customers embracing really the framework to be able to continue to, beyond the capabilities and features. Let's really talk about how are these teams that are tasked with, defining the charter and the cloud journey, how are they really embracing some of these use cases and the framework to be able to tie together the core capabilities of the outcomes they are responsible for. The basic use case most of our customers start is cloud compliance and best practices. Compliance is a business enabler and a business accelerator. IT and the traditional security teams really want to start to embrace a set of guardrails that they want to get agreement with the dev and application teams as they start to really take independence in the cloud adoption journey. The goal of this use case is primarily around the idea that you're operating within a defined limits of risk. From a guardrails perspective, a simple example is, thou shall not have an open S3 bucket, and if you do, it does require an operational sign-off, and we'll monitor for those as part of our, operational controls that we define as part of the shared responsibility matrix. So continuous compliance, as in that you're not running these reports at 30 days in time, you're primarily monitoring for those guardrails continuously within your environment and making sure that you're getting feedback loop on those controls that are in place and holding your teams accountable for those guardrails that you have negotiated early in the process becomes part of where compliance becomes a continuous journey versus a point-in-time assessment. This is, all of this is kind of ties back to some of our outcomes with some of our largest customers. A customer here is a very large Fortune 100 technology company. They're embracing cloud as their destination. They're really starting to adopt massively across their lines of business. The use case that we solve for them is primarily centered around the idea that you define a framework, a set of guardrails that you believe are essential for your organizational reputation, and the IT continuously monitors these guardrails as different development teams and lines of businesses start to embrace cloud more openly. The key outcome that we deliver for this particular customer is once you agree upon the guardrail, once you tune those guardrails in our platform, essentially the development teams and the operational teams that are embracing cloud are completely transparent to those guardrails, and the security team is continuously getting a feedback loop around those guardrails, so they're managing their cloud journey at scale with the speed of their teams and with the risk profile they have defined with these guardrails in mind versus combing through hundreds of pages of reports and kind of really trying to go back and drive this mitigation. They have a continuous feedback loop where they understand how each of those teams are performing against those guardrails, and if they shift or if they kind of deviate from those guardrails, they have a feedback mechanism to be able to escalate and have those teams take the remediation actions there. As you kind of embrace the cloud journey, your journey starts from compliance and really get ready for a potential scenario where the risk of exposure is not that uncommon in cloud infrastructure. Even with all the guardrails in place, if there's a potential scenario, you want to be able to be prepared for a breach detection scenario. The reason it gets important and interesting is there is a lot of regulations in place that are coming down with the measured capabilities around how ready organizational readiness around a breach detection. A good example of this is something like GDPR, where an organization that is bound with GDPR has defined goals and timelines for breach notification. And when you think about something like cloud, where your assets have very limited life cycles, you're using multiple type of asset types and asset technologies, your ability to be able to stitch together this data at scale continuously is going to become challenging. This is where you need to start define some of these capabilities. When you start to explore tool options, is one, the tool needs to cut across all of these silos from infrastructure to host to container to orchestration systems. Two is you need to be able to understand your risk profile across all of these usage models to the point in where a simple example being this API key was never used to change a Kubernetes cluster information. This is the first time we are seeing this. Being able to detect this changing violations across all of these things becomes interesting. And from an incident response and a breach detection standpoint, ability to be able to have access to this data in a future time frame when that asset has completely disappeared from your ephemeral infrastructure, needs to be factored into your planning for an incident response and a breach detection capabilities. Again, this is tying back to a real-world use case for us. Another Fortune 100 company that has embraced our platform. The goal here was, one is pervasive visibility across different layers of their cloud, from infrastructure to a massive scale of deployment across their host machines, and ability to be able to distinguish between a malicious and a non-malicious capability, connection capability. It's something that we really were able to pinpoint to a problem in their particular configuration, even though it was not a security issue. Ability to be able to pinpoint and say that your application misconfiguration is leaking sensitive data to inadvertent sources is something that we were able to detect through just how the application behavior was changing over time. Again, what it really boils down to is, one is being able to have the readiness around this capability. Two is being able to go back historically and stitch together this context, even if those resources were not available. It really becomes critical from a capability standpoint. Breaches as we always say, breaches are rare, investigations are more common. Assuming that you embrace the framework, you build in capabilities across those layers, you're starting to really start driving towards outcomes from a security standpoint of view. What it really boils down to is that investigations can be both breach driven, or investigations can be more internal driven from a point of view of how well you are doing within your cloud infrastructures. This is where we are starting to hear the lack of expertise and skill set available in the market today. As more teams start to embrace cloud, there is really a resource crunch in terms of the intersection of cloud and security from a people and a staffing perspective. What it really boils down to is that where do you really invest your most expensive and critical resources, either to build tools and stitch together the data, really drive the necessary capabilities from a security standpoint. What we're really starting to see around here is, one, most teams are doing at least 3 to 4 investigations per week. Around different change in usage models around the shared responsibility architecture, right? If you have a change in control, change in guardrails, or change in user behavior, you're starting to really take the time to at least get into like 2 or 3 of these investigations. Where the investigations can take them is deeper and deeper. It's kind of like going down the rabbit hole problem, right? You start at the infrastructure layer. You want to understand in terms of how am I using my cloud, which APIs were orchestrated, who are using those APIs, which API access key was in use. Then it gets into is which user was involved in that, which geo region were they coming from, what privilege levels were they using, and going one more level deep is which asset was impacted, what is the type of the asset, is it a host, is it a Kubernetes cluster, is it a container, and is it an actual VM? And where does that VM belong to? Does it belong to my prod? Does it belong to my dev? Essentially, the story continues on. So simply think about from your perspective is, as you take responsibility of the cloud journey, as you define your organizational outcome, take into the consideration that while breaches do seldom happen, investigations are a more common scenario, and you want to be able to have capabilities that cuts across these different layers and give you ability to be able to stitch together the context, so you can really are answering the question that, is it really an uncommon scenario, or we just have a new behavior within our organization that has not been factored into the initial planning. That is something to factor into your planning exercise. This is again another story that we bring to the bear in working with some of our larger customers is that this is an on-prem story with a cloud workflow in mind, an on-prem data center that has a cloud DevOps model that they have orchestrated our capabilities into their virtual machines. our ability to be able to stitch together machines, application, user, and process data, and more importantly, tie it to third-party threat intel data, and being able to pinpoint that one of your processes are starting to really starting to talk to about a threat actors outside of your organization, and this threat actor has a reputation of not being in the good side of the threat threat intel risk score, and more importantly, it started with one asset and it's starting to really propagate across your infrastructure from a blast radius perspective, because all of these machines have a tag of dev and staging. It really brings to bear is, one is you have a complete single point of view from in terms of where do you go investigate, and two is what is the impact assessment there is, three is more importantly how do you contain it, what kind of remedial action you need to do, and all of this without having to stitch together the data really becomes a critical capability when you're operating at scale. And we also recognize that not all teams start cloud the same way. We are starting to see different teams and different spectrum when it comes to their cloud journey. The more experimenting cloud migrants are starting to really adopt that they're deploying one or two applications, experimenting with the cloud, perfecting their cloud workflows. Two is they're really starting to expand their cloud workflows, and three is where they're really operating at scale. We kind of define this as a cloud security maturity model to give you some kind of a guidance around how do you really start to embrace capabilities around these areas, and really what do you need to start building in today to be able to support this cloud migration journey. And again, I'll tie back to what we really started out with, right? What we really started out with is the second wave of cloud migration. As your enterprise infrastructure moves out to adoption of platform as a service or infrastructure as a service in public cloud environments, multi-cloud, becomes interesting, and also it's both an opportunity and a risk when it comes to organizational responsibilities. The two teams that kind of bear the responsibility on these things is security teams and DevOps teams. DevOps owns the responsibility for scale and speed of innovation. Security owns the responsibility for risk management and compliance. And it's important for having an organizational framework as to how both of these two teams comes together and define organizational outcomes when it comes to speed and scale and risk and compliance. And we believe automation is that middle ground when it comes to tools or capabilities. Automation is that middle ground where both of these teams can embrace and build into their planning process, so that you're really engineered for that scale. And when there is something that goes wrong in this journey, the security teams can really pinpoint with accurate and actionable information from the point of view of compliance and risk. And the DevOps teams can embrace that this is not impending their scale and the speed of journey, and both of them kind of operate at a level plane where each of them are kind of feeding on the different details within the journey, but more importantly, they're operating for the common goal. We've been recognized as one of the cool vendors by Gartner. Our journey continues to takes us to very interesting places with both small and large organizations. Our goal is to become the bridge that embraces this transformation across the organization, bringing both the security and DevOps teams together, so that you focus on your cloud journey versus building tools and capabilities, versus more on outcomes like compliance to breach detection to investigation are factored into the planning process versus you have to define it very explicitly. We are happy to, one of the things that we offer is a free cloud and threat risk assessment. I would encourage, those who are on the initial, either in the planning stages of the journey or they're already in the journey, to really experience the difference you can see within our platform. It's a 30-day risk-free trial to be able to really look at the kind of visibility and the automation we can enable for both of these teams to collaborate better in your cloud journey. So that we can really show the value differentiation in terms of why a framework is necessary and why it needs to cut across both DevOps and security teams. We'll take the time, Hilary, we'll take the time to take this. We have been some questions from the audience, and we can take some time to be able to answer those questions.
Awesome. So just a reminder, folks, that if you have a question for our speaker today, feel free to enter that in the questions or ask a question tab at the bottom of the screen. We have already had several roll in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the ones we have. The first question that I'm seeing says, do you think that identity is a new perimeter is a true statement in the cloud? Will network-related controls in the cloud diminish its importance?
Great question. Thank you for asking that question. As you embrace the cloud as your final destination, as you start to really delve into the APIs as your basis for access management and control, and ability to be able to orchestrate resources in the cloud using those APIs, identity becomes a very critical aspect. And it is, I would agree that it is a new parameter in terms of understanding, who has access to what capabilities and how they are using those capabilities becomes important. I would not really say that, network-related controls have lost its place in cloud. They do have their place, from the perspective that which assets have accessibility from where, from a footprint perspective, becomes important. But there is definitely a redefinition in terms of what network-related controls. It's not definitely the firewalls that, traditionally, from a traditional sense, these are more capabilities that are provided by the cloud providers, like a security group, that are co-located with the asset itself. Next question, Hillary.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that. The next question I have here says, should security controls in the cloud with DevSecOps be more tailored to specific apps? Uniqueness of each app and use case is important. That's in parentheses. Or should it be, more towards controls for cloud services in general? So each app team must design their app around predefined security controls.
Great question again. One of the things that we are observing in our journey as a company in the last 5 years is that different teams within different organizations are starting to really embrace a variety of choices available for them when it comes to cloud infrastructures. Like some teams embrace Google GCP for their machine learning capabilities. Some teams, embrace AWS just for ease of use and available automation. It really boils down to is, the controls that you pick at each individual cloud level should be geared towards your compliance and risk management capabilities, and the controls must be negotiated with the team that's really, using that app within those constructs. And two is from a security and organizational risk standpoint, all of these controls need to tie back to a single pane of glass that you can use that cuts across these different applications and different infrastructures, so that you're not kind of scrambling that I'm managing my AWS differently, I'm managing my GCP differently, or managing one compliant set of guardrails across all of these infrastructures. So organizationally, you're prepared for both your, your compliance objectives as well as your risk objectives.
All right, the next question that I have here says, for multi-cloud deployments, would you prefer native cloud security tools or third parties to the same for the same tools across all clouds?
Great question again. From a multi-cloud deployment perspective, there are really two aspects of this. The controls that you kind of embrace within the cloud provider, and the controls that you want to be able to cut across all of the cloud providers. I would say finding a fine balance between both is going to be essential, because it's basically incentives that not, each of those cloud providers, drive towards different incentives and different goals. And you as an organizational, as you adopt these different cloud providers, need to define your risk pair and risk objectives, and being able to leverage existing controls on the cloud provider side and then tie it back to a third party tool that cuts across all of these clouds and give you a single pane of view becomes essential when it comes to really defining that you're operating at a defined risk level across all of these clouds. But both have it to net of it is both have its place. It really boils down to is, do you want, how do you define your security objectives across all of these clouds?
All right. The next question I have here says, why are you providing external security, and then how, this question is worded strangely. Sorry. So why are you providing external security, and then how is the cloud provider, did they miss or didn't fill that security in the first place? Is that why that is being provided?
There are really two parts to this. I'll kind of define it for both from the company that's providing a solution in the space and the providers that are available with the existing capabilities. One, I'll start with the basis that most cloud providers have invested heavily in different security capabilities. And moving from an on-prem infrastructure to a cloud wall, I would say that there's a lot more velocity and capabilities that are available to be able to secure your assets within the cloud infrastructure. The second aspect of it is, where do you really want to spend your resources, and the most expensive resources? There are capabilities, as I tie back to my last answer, there are capabilities within cloud provider that are there that provide a baseline set of risk management, and guard duty is a great example of that. But it really is geared towards that one provider and one capability, and where a provider like us, a third-party security capability like us is, our goal is to be able to cut across multiple providers, multiple asset types, where you change the conversation from really managing tools to really managing your outcomes for risk and compliance. And this is where you really need to start to evaluate is, how are you resourced from a staffing perspective? Do you have the bandwidth and the capability to be able to really instrument and orchestrate individual controls within the cloud provider and guarantee the security outcomes? Or do you want to really go define your framework and capabilities that you can mix in a provider, a third-party tool, but really drive your security outcomes as an organization? There's one question about the demo. What I would encourage is that please sign up for our Cloud and Risk Threat Assessment that includes a demo and a managed onboarding that gives you a full swath of capabilities around how we operate and what are the depth of the capabilities we bring to bear. I would really encourage you guys to sign up and see that in action.
All right, we have another question here asking about ransomware. So does your security framework include protection against something like ransomware?
Yeah, I would consider like something like, yes, the short answer is yes. The long answer is the framework has different layers that helps you to look at different aspects of ransomware from the point of view of what was your exploitation point, where does this start, how impactful it was across the organization, what are your assets that are impacted, being able to create a complete breach report around that. All of those capabilities we do integrate with third-party threat intel resources, so you would be able to identify the source, the malware itself, the characteristic of the malware. But where it becomes really important is understanding really how it got into your organization, where your weak points are from a configuration standpoint or from a footprint standpoint. It goes beyond just the ransomware itself.
All right, it looks like that is all the questions that we have. Thank you everyone so much for attending today's webinar, and have a wonderful day.